sit her down, or we'll postpone the hearing. Those are the rules, Delara Vexley snapped, tapping the courtroom rail like she owned it. And if your daughter can't behave, this injunction is already dead in the water. The arrogance in her voice cut through the room. She didn't look at Morel. She didn't even acknowledge the trembling in my daughter's hands. Delara Vexley, president of the Marrow Glen HOA board, treated this courtroom like an extension of her living room, another space she believed she controlled. You shouldn't have brought her here, she added, loud enough for the gallery to hear. Children who disrupt community harmony shouldn't testify at all. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Delara, your son's compliance logs weren't written by a psychologist. I can tell. Her smirk faltered for one fractional beat, and for the first time since this war began, she realized I knew something she didn't want anyone to know, something only a professional could see. If you're watching this and you've ever dealt with a power-drunk HOA president who thinks a title makes them untouchable, subscribe right now. You're going to need what comes next. My name is Alaric Winford, and I wasn't just a father sitting in a courtroom. I built my entire career evaluating behavioral threats inside federal courthouses. I knew what escalation looked like. I knew the signs people missed when danger walked into a room wearing a clean shirt and forced smile. And I knew long before today that Brannick Vexley was a storm waiting for a spark. But before you think this is just another HOA squabble, let me make something clear. Myrle wasn't fighting fines or paint colors or mailbox angles. She was fighting history. My daughter survived a lockdown event at her old school and ordeal that hollowed out months of her life and rewired how she breathed on bad days. When I moved us to Marrow Glen, I thought I'd given her calm, stability, a place to rebuild a childhood interrupted. Delara destroyed that illusion the moment she accused my daughter of social destabilization for refusing to let Brannick corner a younger boy at the community bonfire. A grown woman weaponized paperwork to rewrite my daughter's courage as criminal. And then she tried to drag her into that farce of a behavioral review board to make an example of her. Everything in me told me that if I didn't stop the HOA right then, someone else would get hurt. I just didn't know how soon that someone would be my own daughter. Inside the courtroom, the air tightened not because of the judge, not because of the injunction, but because Brannick sat in the gallery 2 rows behind us. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. He hovered there, knees bouncing, fingers gripping a sketchbook he never opened. I recognized the posture, the hyper-focus, the micro-tremors, not nervousness, activation. Delara kept glancing back at him, whispering sharp fragments of direction. Control him. Restrain him. Perform for me. She didn't see the risk signs because she wasn't trained to, but I was. And when his foot tapped out a rhythm I'd seen in countless case files, I knew we were seconds away from something irreversible. I placed my hand over Myrel's. "You're safe," I whispered. She nodded, but her eyes flickered toward Brannick like a shadow she couldn't avoid. The judge called her name. She stood to testify, guided by her child advocate, and that tiny act my daughter rising to speak truth ignited the fuse Delara had spent years burying under false reports and forged compliance logs. Brannick's sketchbook hit the floor first, then he surged forward. He moved faster than a 15-year-old should. The blade wasn't obvious at first glance. It looked like a stylus, something harmless, something a kid might use in art class. But when it glinted under the fluorescent lights, I saw the truth. I was already moving when he reached her, but the bailiff was faster. A thunderclap of motion chairs scraping, a shout ripped from the gallery, the slam of 2 bodies hitting the ground. Myrle screamed as the blade cut across her forearm. The sound tore through me, not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of sound a child makes when the world betrays them. The room erupted. The judge stood. Delara froze, eyes wide, mask shattered. And in that instant, every fine, every false allegation, every manipulative HOA tactic became something bigger, something the state could no longer ignore. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was the moment outside authority had been waiting for. They moved us into a side room after the attack, the kind with beige walls and a metal table that pretends to make people feel calm. Morel sat beside me, her arm wrapped, her breathing tight and uneven. Every few seconds she flinched, not because of pain, but because she kept replaying the moment Brannick lunged. Trauma doesn't need time to settle, it blooms instantly. A deputy asked questions, the kind they need for paperwork, but my focus drifted back to where this really began. Everyone in that courtroom would think today was the first eruption. They'd assume this was one sudden, violent moment. But violence never arrives unannounced. It builds. It signals. It warns. And in Marrow Glen, it started months earlier, long before a blade touched my daughter's skin. The HOA had always sold itself as a community of emotional harmony, but I learned quickly that harmony was just a weapon in Delara Vexley's hands. She used it to punish anyone who didn't fit her script. The first warning came after the fall bonfire, a notice on my door, printed with the usual sterile formatting, behavioral concern, minor exhibiting destabilizing tendencies. They were referring to Myrelle, 14 years old, quiet, recovering, a girl who stepped between a scared boy and Brannick's cornering behavior. The notice didn't mention that part. The next week, there were two more. One accusing us of creating social tension with neighbors. Another claiming our security camera was angled with hostile intent. I knew harassment when I saw it. I also knew that Delara's power didn't come from authority, it came from compliance. People in Marrow Glen obeyed because they feared embarrassment, fines, or losing their spotless community reputation. Fear is fertile ground for tyrants. I tried to ignore it at first. I kept telling myself the board would back off, that this was about a misunderstanding, not a calculated campaign. But the shift in the neighborhood atmosphere was impossible to miss. Conversations shortened. Eye contact vanished. Kids who used to wave at Morel now avoided her, tugged away by parents who'd read too many HOA emails twisted into warnings. I confronted Delara once, at the community center courtyard. She was standing beneath the inkstone mosaic, the mural the kids built tile by tile, including the one my daughter made during therapy. It glimmered in the afternoon light, a symbol of rebuilding, a symbol Delara had no right to touch. "You're targeting us," I told her. She smiled without warmth. "We're maintaining harmony. Your daughter disrupts that." She protected another child. Interpretations differ. I recognized the tactic instantly. Redirection, gaslighting, passive framing to mask aggression. I've profiled hundreds of people like her. They harm through structure, not rage. They weaponize rules, then hide behind them. But if the courtyard conversation created tension, the email she sent the neighborhood detonated it. A mass message titled, "Community Alert, Youth Behavioral Instability." Inside, she wrote that certain minors were threatening the emotional cohesion of Marrow Glen. She didn't say Myrelle's name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. By the time the HOA announced a behavioral review board hearing for my daughter, the air in that neighborhood felt poisonous. I refused to put her in that room. I refused to hand her over to a committee with no training, no oversight, and no right to interrogate a minor. I filed the injunction that led us to court. And now we were back in this side room, the aftermath still echoing in every movement around us. A medic checked Morelle's pulse. She pulled her arm away slightly, the defensive reflex of someone who'd been cornered before. I placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You did nothing wrong," I whispered. She didn't answer, but she leaned into my palm, steadying herself. Outside the door, I heard muffled voices, officials coordinating, deputies reporting, the bailiff confirming the weapon. They spoke with urgency now, the kind that didn't exist when this was just an HOA matter. I knew what was coming. Incidents involving minors in a courthouse trigger mandatory reporting. Patterns get reviewed. Behavior logs get scrutinized. And once the state saw the discrepancies in Brannick's records, discrepancies Delara created, there would be no burying this. The deputy returned with his clipboard. "We'll need to file a detailed account," he said. I nodded. I'd give them every detail they required. But the report wouldn't stop there. Not this time. Today hadn't just exposed a violent teenager, it exposed the structure that enabled him. The false logs, the coerced silence, the HOA's overreach. Myrelle took a shaky breath. "Dad, I didn't mean for any of this. You spoke up because someone needed help," I said. "That's strength. And it's why they tried to silence you." Her eyes filled, not with fear now, but with something heavier, betrayal. She trusted this community once. She believed she could rebuild here. That trust was gone, and as I sat beside her in that dim side room, the truth settled fully into place. Today wasn't an end. It was ignition. The moment the state would finally see everything I'd been seeing for months. Outside authority wasn't just going to intervene. They were going to dismantle whatever Delara had built. They let us leave the courthouse through a side exit to avoid the reporters already gathering near the front steps. Word travels fast when violence erupts inside a judicial building, especially when the assailant is the son of an HOA president with a reputation for spotless control. Delara stood near the entrance, giving frantic, hushed statements to anyone who'd listen, her voice sharp and defensive. She didn't look at us as we walked past. She couldn't. Not after what happened in front of a judge. Myril held my hand tightly as we reached the parking structure. Her skin was cold, her body still wired with leftover shock, but she kept moving. She always keeps moving. It's one of the things I admire most about her, even when the world tries to knock her down. I helped her into the passenger seat, adjusted her sling, and tried not to let my anger show. She didn't need to absorb that. Not today. As I closed her door, a voice behind me said, "Alaric, wait." I turned to find Thorne Mallon, the HOA's compliance officer, standing a few yards away. He looked nothing like the calm enforcer who delivered notices with mechanical precision. His face was pale, throat tight, hands shoved deep into his pockets like he was afraid of what they'd reveal if he let them loose. "I shouldn't be talking to you here," he said quietly. His eyes darted toward the cameras by the elevators, then toward the walkway where Delara was still standing. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of her. "You saw everything," I said. "There's nothing left to hide." He exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between guilt and resignation. I never imagined he'd actually hurt someone. We all thought it was just outbursts. "No," I said. "You didn't think." She didn't think. "And now, a 14-year-old has stitches because all of you chose silence." His shoulders tensed at that, and for a moment I thought he'd walk away. But he stayed rooted, trembling on the edge of confession. Thorne wasn't like Delara. He didn't enjoy power. He was swallowed by it. Overwhelmed by a system he helped uphold without ever asking who it harmed. "I tried to get her to listen," he murmured. There were reports 3. Families complaining about Brannick's aggression. I logged them. She deleted 2 and rewrote the 3rd. That was the first thread of truth pulling itself free. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence do the work. "She said he was misunderstood," Thorne continued. "Said he needed a clean record so he could reinforce community trust. She told me if we wrote him up, it would encourage other parents to make false claims to get out of board decisions. So she buried the warnings," I said. His jaw tightened. "She told me to, and I did it." I thought it wasn't my place to question. The guilt wasn't performative. It pulsed through him, bringing a flush to his face and a tremor to his voice. This wasn't an ally yet, but it was someone cracking under the weight of complicity. "Thorne," I said, steady. "Brannick didn't escalate overnight. This was predictable. This was preventable." He closed his eyes. "I know." A car honked above us, startling him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Delara's going to try to control the narrative. She's going to blame you. She's going to claim you provoked him by filing the injunction. She can try." "She will," he insisted. "She's already setting up a board announcement to frame this as a family conflict. She doesn't want the state digging into our conduct records. And you?" I asked. "What do you want?" He hesitated, swallowing hard. I want to do the right thing. But if I speak against her openly, she'll scorch my career. She'll tell the board I mishandled protocol. And honestly, she'll make them believe it. So you're choosing fear." "No," he said quickly. Then softer, "I'm choosing caution, for now." That was the truth of him, a man caught between self-preservation and a conscience he couldn't silence anymore. But conscience has a way of growing louder the longer it's ignored. Today's violence had shaken something loose in him. "Thorne," I said, "you came to me, not to defend her, not to spin the story. You came because you know the state's going to intervene, and because you know what happens next will depend on what you decide to do." He looked at me like that possibility terrified him. "I need time," he whispered. "You don't have much," I replied. "Delara will rewrite the facts before the blood dries." A tremor rippled through him. Then he nodded once. sharp and almost involuntary. I'll be in touch. He walked away quickly, shoulders hunched, head down. Not ready to stand against her, but no longer willing to stand with her. I watched him disappear into the rows of cars, and I knew something had shifted. Today hadn't only exposed a violent teenager, it had exposed the fracture inside the HOA's own ranks. A fracture that, if widened, could bring everything Delara built crashing down. And Thorne Mallon, whether he was ready or not, had just taken the first step toward widening it. By the time we got home, the sun had dipped behind the Marrow Glen rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. Everything looked normal, quiet, manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, symmetrical houses, but the normality felt staged now, like a set built to hide what simmered beneath it. I helped Morel inside, settled her on the couch, and made sure she had her medication within reach. She drifted into a shallow sleep, the kind where the body shuts down but the mind still rattles. I stepped outside for air, needing a moment to think, to sharpen the edges of everything that had just happened. That was when I saw it. Another notice pinned to my front door. A violation. On today of all days. I pulled it off the wood, and the paper shook in my hand not because of the wind, but because a part of me knew this wasn't coincidence. Delara didn't act randomly. Every move she made was calculated, weaponized, and timed for maximum psychological pressure. The notice read, "Non-compliance fine, failure to attend mandated behavioral assessment hearing. The amount was obscene for a supposed administrative offense." At the bottom, her signature curled like a threat sharp, practiced, unmistakably hers. Even after her son stabbed my daughter in a courtroom, she still dared. I stood on the porch and let the anger settle, not boil. Anger clouds judgment, and judgment was my craft. Marrow Glen's HOA wasn't just an inconvenient board, it was a structure fortified by people who believed fear could govern more effectively than fairness. And today proved just how far that structure would go to protect itself. A door opened across the street. Mrs. Harland, who used to wave at us every morning, stepped out to collect a package. She glanced in my direction and immediately looked away, pretending she didn't see me. I didn't take it personally. That's how community coercion works. When one person becomes the board's target, everyone else learns to look elsewhere. I walked down the driveway, letting my steps slow, letting my mind reconstruct the pattern. The HOA's escalation wasn't spontaneous, it was sequential. Target a child, smear the family, create social suspicion, apply financial pressure, and when all else fails, drag the target into an illegitimate disciplinary structure. They counted on people breaking in silence. They hadn't counted on a father who understood escalation indicators better than anyone in that neighborhood. As I reached the sidewalk, a familiar rumble approached the HOA security patrol cart, driven by a man named Caldwell. He slowed as he neared my property, giving me a stiff nod. His radio crackled with chatter I couldn't make out, but the way his eyes flicked to the notice in my hand told me everything. Someone had already told him to watch me. He rolled past without a word. Inside the house, I heard footsteps upstairs, soft, hesitant. Myra was awake. I went in and found her standing by her window, staring out at the street like it was a place she didn't recognize anymore. "Dad," she said quietly, "are they going to make it worse?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to promise her safety in a world that didn't guarantee it. But she deserved truth, not false comfort. "They're going to try," I said, "but they're losing control." She hugged herself, as if gathering her pieces back together. "It feels like they're everywhere. They have reach," I said, "not power." The difference mattered, and soon it would matter to everyone in Marrow Glen. After settling her again, I stepped outside once more, this time to examine the community environment with clinical precision. The violation notice wasn't an isolated act. It was part of the HOA's continued attempt to force the narrative that today's violence was not their failure, but somehow mine. I walked to the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. New papers had been posted since the morning. One printed in red caught my attention immediately. Special meeting addressing recent disruptions. Disruptions, not violence. Not a stabbing. Disruptions. The language was deliberate. Minimize the incident. Shift accountability. Present a calm, responsible board addressing disorder caused by someone else. I pulled the paper down and folded it. Another neighbor approached the mailboxes but froze when he saw me. His eyes dipped toward the bandage peeking from under my shirt, where Myral's blood had smeared hours earlier when I carried her out. "I heard what happened," he murmured. He kept glancing around, making sure no one else heard. "My wife said the board is telling people your daughter provoked him. That wasn't rumor. That was strategy." "Did she see the attack?" I asked. "No. But Delara sent a message to the block captains." "Of course she had." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry. I know the truth, but people here, they don't want trouble." I nodded. Trouble arrived long before today. He left quickly, as though my presence itself put him in danger. By the time I walked back home, the pattern was undeniable. The HOA wasn't retreating. They were fortifying. Woven into their behavior was a singular motive: protect themselves by burying the truth. What they didn't understand was that today's violence didn't bury anything. It exposed everything, and every move they made now only fed the inevitable force already beginning to circle them, outside authority. They could ignore me, but they wouldn't escape the state. Morning came without softness. The light through the blinds felt clinical, sharp, the kind of light that doesn't warm a room but exposes it. I hadn't slept, not really. I kept replaying the courtroom attack frame by frame, not out of obsession, but because that's what trained minds do. We examine, we sequence, we interpret. And this time, the data wasn't abstract. It was my daughter. Morel was still asleep upstairs, her breathing steadier than last night. I let her rest. She'd earned whatever peace her body could salvage. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, spreading out the files and behavioral notes I'd kept over the last 2 months. Not records stolen from garages or storage rooms, just observations. Patterns, interactions, my own professional log of the HOA's escalation and the behavioral irregularities surrounding Brannick Vexley. Most people don't notice escalation indicators until it's too late. They see isolated moments, outbursts, incidents, but I see accumulation, trends that speak louder than any single event. And as I reviewed my notes, the pattern became undeniable. Everything pointed to a structure that hid predictable danger behind curated normalcy. The first note was from the bonfire night, my observation of Brannick's reactive aggression when challenged. The second was a meeting where he hovered behind Delara, shoulders tight, scanning the room with hypervigilance. The third was a hallway encounter where he stared at a younger boy with a fixation I recognized instantly. Individually, these moments meant little. Together, they spelled out risk, but something else had been bothering me, something outside the boy himself. The logs, Delara's sanitized records. I'd seen them in meeting summaries and neighbor reports. They were always suspiciously consistent, too polished, too synchronized with whatever public narrative she was shaping. I pulled up the HOA's digital archive, which I had requested access to months ago under the pretense of reviewing community wellness initiatives. The documents she'd signed weren't clinical reviews. They weren't written by someone with psychological training. They were templated statements dressed up as assessments, built from stock phrasing. I opened one of the behavioral compliance notes Delara had issued for her son. The language was wrong. Not merely untrained, manufactured. The phrasing mimicked professional documentation but failed every authenticity check. No diagnostic codes, no operational definitions, no measurable behaviors, just fluff wrapped in administrative authority. Worse, each report concluded with the same sentence: no foreseeable risk of escalation. No one in my field writes that. Evage. It's a red flag by itself, a guarantee of liability. My pulse shifted, not from panic, but from clarity. She wasn't just covering up her son's behavior. She was manufacturing innocence. And then there was the timestamp issue. On 3 separate logs, the metadata showed the original file creation date was several days before the reported incidents they supposedly responded to, meaning she wrote the reports preemptively, prepared defenses before problems existed, or rather before the problems she expected were reported. That was the point where everything clicked into place. Delara didn't attempt to manage risk. She attempted to erase it. I leaned back, letting the implications widen in front of me. If an HOA president knowingly falsified behavioral logs for a minor with a documented pattern of aggression and then pressured the community to treat him as harmless, that wasn't just negligence. It was institutional misconduct. the kind that triggers state intervention automatically. I pulled out one of my own work binders on courthouse safety protocols. Inside were case references where organizational cover-ups had led to external audits, liability reviews, and state-level takeovers. The parallels weren't distant, they were almost identical. My phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. 2 words. "We need to talk." Thon. Of course. He'd reached his breaking point faster than I expected. Guilt does that. Once it cracks open, it doesn't close easily. I texted him back, offering a place and time. He didn't respond immediately, but that was fine. He'd come. I returned to the screen, scrolling through log after log, cross-checking phrases, comparing metadata. Every inconsistency was fuel. Every falsified line was a breadcrumb leading the state directly to Merrow Glen's front door. The more I uncovered, the more the pressure in my chest shifted, not panic, but purpose. This wasn't just about clearing my daughter's name anymore. It wasn't even about justice for what happened in that courtroom. It was about exposing a system that had enabled danger while punishing the people who tried to prevent it. Down the hall, I heard Morel stirring. Light footsteps. A pause. The familiar sound of her steadying herself before walking. I closed the files but left the laptop open. She didn't need to see the logs yet. She didn't need to know how deep this went. Not until the state stepped in. I stood as she entered the kitchen, her arm bandaged, her eyes still bruised with remnants of fear. But there was something else there to resolve. She sat down across from me, and for a moment we just breathed the same air, silent but connected. "Dad," she whispered, "they're not going to get away with this, are they?" "No," I said, not as hope, but as fact. Not anymore, because now I had proof. And proof is something even an HOA president can't outrun. By early afternoon, the house felt too still, not peaceful, suspended. The kind of quiet that follows a storm but promises another. Myra rested upstairs, her breathing softer now, though every shift of her body reminded me the wound was still fresh, still part of her. I checked on her twice before stepping outside again, needing the open air to think clearly. The walk to the inkstone mosaic shouldn't have felt heavy. It was only a few blocks away, nestled in the courtyard where children once painted their stories into tile. The place had always meant healing for her, a space where her hands shaped something gentle, something hopeful. She spent hours there last spring, laying her tile with the gold streak she said represented safe light. So when I reached the mosaic and saw the damage, I stopped breathing. Her tile, her piece of recovery, was shattered. Not cracked by accident, not worn by weather. Shattered. The edges were sharp where someone had struck it with force. Across the broken pieces, someone had sprayed a single word in black paint. Liar. My vision narrowed. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with something colder. Delara claimed to preserve community harmony, yet this was the community she shaped, one where a wounded girl was labeled a liar instead of a survivor. I crouched beside the shattered tile, careful not to touch the edges. Vandalism in a public community space wasn't just cruelty, it was documented evidence of community conflict escalation, often linked to targeted harassment. In courthouse training sessions, I'd taught law clerks to identify patterns exactly like this: social retaliation following public allegations. This wasn't random, it was a message, a warning, an attempt to shame her into silence. Footsteps approached behind me, quick and hesitant. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I recognized the sound, someone who wanted to appear confident but carried the weight of fear. "Mister." Harlan stopped a few feet away. I saw this earlier," he said, voice unsteady. "I thought the board would clean it up." "They didn't," I replied. "They probably didn't know," he tried. "They knew." I stood, letting the full reality of the vandalism settle. This mosaic is monitored. There are cameras on the lampposts. Someone saw this. Someone chose to ignore it. He swallowed hard. I could almost see the moment he regretted walking over. "Look, people are scared. After the attack, no one knows what's going to happen. That's because they're listening to the wrong voices." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Fear speaks in silence. I headed back home with the image of the shattered tile burned into me. I didn't have time to wait for apologies or half-hearted concern. The injunction hearing had already created a paper trail. The courtroom attack had triggered mandatory reports. But vandalism shifted the stakes. It showed escalating community hostility tied directly to my daughter's testimony. That pattern mattered to external agencies. When I returned home, I found Morel sitting at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. Not anymore. She looked like someone who'd run out of tears and found resolve instead. "I saw it from my window," she said quietly. "The mosaic." I sat beside her. "You don't need to go back there until it's safe. It was mine," she whispered. "Not the whole thing, but my piece was mine. They didn't have the right." "No," I said. "They didn't." She took a shaky breath. "Why do they hate me so much?" "They don't hate you," I said gently. "They fear the truth. You told the truth about Brannick. That makes you dangerous to people who rely on lies." She looked down at her bandaged arm. "It feels like the whole place is against us." "Not the whole place," I said. "Some people are just too scared to stand up yet." Her eyes lifted, searching mine. "Are you scared? Of them?" I shook my head. "Not anymore." I meant it. Something in me had shifted the moment I saw that broken tile. Vandalism wasn't a final blow, it was a beginning. A catalyst. It pushed this conflict out of community politics and into the realm of state interest. HOA disputes rarely escalate into violence or targeted retaliation. When they do, external authorities step in not as neighbors, not as mediators, but as investigators. I stood and helped her to her feet. "I'm filing the emergency injunction today, not just against the Behavioral Review Board, against the HOA's authority over minors. This gives us jurisdictional protection and forces the state to review their conduct." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. "Will it work?" "It already started working the moment they broke your tile," I said. "That's evidence of targeted retaliation tied to your testimony. The state doesn't ignore that." For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to breathe without holding tension in her shoulders. A small release, a tiny reclaiming of ground. As she went upstairs again to rest, I gathered the photographs I'd taken at the mosaic, along with the metadata of the HOA logs I'd analyzed earlier. Everything formed a mosaic of its own, a pattern of misconduct, denial, and escalating hostility. Today wasn't just about assessing risk, it was about committing to action. And once the emergency injunction was filed, the HOA's power over my daughter wouldn't just weaken, it would fracture. Thorne texted me just after dusk, 15 minutes, same place, no explanations, no hedging, just urgency. I left Morel resting on the couch, her headphones on, a blanket over her legs. She'd insisted I go when I told her who had reached out. "If he's finally talking," she'd whispered, "don't let him back out." The walk to the Riverside Park cut through the quieter edge of Marrow Glen, where the houses thinned and the HOA's grip felt a little less suffocating. The sky had turned violet, the river carrying the last of the daylight with it. The park wasn't empty, but people kept to themselves. No children played. No dogs barked. Even silence felt supervised in this neighborhood. Thorne stood under a lamppost near the path, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the strap of a messenger bag slung across him. He wasn't pacing, but he looked like he wanted to. When he saw me, relief flickered across his face along with fear. Real fear. Not of me. Of what he was about to say aloud. "You came alone," he said, voice low. "You asked me to," I replied. "What's going on?" He glanced around, then stepped off the path toward the water, motioning for me to follow. We stopped near a cluster of bare trees where the wind cut off most ambient noise. He exhaled hard, then rubbed his palms against his jeans as if bracing himself. "I shouldn't be doing this," he said. "But after what happened, after today, I can't keep pretending I don't see it." Good. That meant something had cracked open deep inside him. "What did you find?" I asked. He shook his head. "It's not one thing. It's everything. The board, Delara, the reports, all of it." The messenger bag shifted as he adjusted it, but he didn't open it. Not yet. The hesitation wasn't about whether to talk, it was about how much he was willing to risk. "Start wherever you need," I said. He looked toward the river, the dark water moving steadily forward, exactly the way his conscience had finally begun to move. "You were right about the logs," he said. "They're not real. She wrote half of them before the incidents even happened. She formatted them to imitate state-level documentation, and she told me to co-sign them." Shame tightened his voice. I did. I didn't know how to say no. You knew enough to feel wrong about it. Feeling wrong isn't the same as acting right, he said. It wasn't defensive, just painfully honest. He shifted again, as though fighting against the instinct to flee. But he stayed. He faced me because whatever guilt he'd carried had grown heavier than whatever consequences he feared. There's more, he continued. After the bonfire incident, 3 parents filed concerns about Brannick's behavior. One said he grabbed their son hard enough to leave marks. Another said he followed their daughter home from the bus stop for 3 days. And another witnessed him throwing rocks at younger kids during recess. I absorbed each detail with sinking clarity. These were escalation predictors patterns that always carried forward unless someone intervened. What happened to the reports? I asked. I submitted them, he said quietly. Delara deleted 2 of them outright. The third, she rewrote to make the parent sound unstable. Then she logged the concern as a misinterpretation due to community fatigue. A chill moved through the wind. That's why she created the Behavioral Review Board, I said. Not to correct children, to control parents. He nodded. She wanted something she could weaponize, something that looked official but wasn't bound by actual law. We stood without speaking for a few moments. The lamppost hummed behind us. Somewhere down the path, someone's footsteps echoed briefly before fading. She's trying to spin the stabbing already, Thorne said suddenly. She told the board that you provoked the attack with your injunction. That Brannick acted out of emotional distress caused by your refusal to participate in the review board. My jaw tightened. She's framing a courtroom assault as a family dispute. She doesn't see limits, he whispered. She doesn't see consequences. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered his bag and finally opened it not wide enough for anyone passing by to see, just enough to show me what he carried. Inside were documents I didn't touch. I recognized the formatting instantly. Board communications, internal memos, timestamp inconsistencies, deleted entries, overwritten logs. He hadn't brought them to give to me. That was still a step too far for him, but bringing them at all meant everything. I can't hand these over. Not yet, he said, but I needed you to see they exist. I needed you to know I'm not imagining the corruption. You took a risk meeting me. No, he said. I took a risk staying silent this long. A moment passed where neither of us moved. What do you want, Thorne? I asked. Not from me. From yourself. He swallowed hard, eyes glistening in the lamplight. I want to help. But I don't know how to do it without burning everything down. Then we burn it carefully, I said, with truth, not chaos. He closed the messenger bag and stepped back. I'm not brave, he whispered. You will be, I said. You already started. He nodded once, sharp and decisive, as though committing to a path he couldn't walk backward from, and as he walked away into the dark, I knew this was the turning point, the quiet fracture inside the HOA that would become a fault line. Thorne Mallon had just chosen a side, and it wasn't Delara's anymore. I didn't go home right away. Not after what Thorne revealed. I needed to think without walls around me, without the weight of Myrel's quiet breathing reminding me what was at stake. I walked the long way back, past the tennis courts, past the empty pool deck, past all the places where Marrow Glen pretended to be perfect. The night air sharpened my senses, cleared the fog of anger, and left me with something cleaner purpose. By the time I reached my driveway, I already knew what had to happen next. Inside, the house was silent. Myrel had fallen asleep on the couch, curled into herself like she was protecting the wound even in dreams. I covered her with a blanket, paused for a moment, then stepped into my office and closed the door behind me. The desk lamp cast a tight circle of light over the papers I'd laid out earlier. My behavioral notes, screenshots, photos of the shattered mosaic, and printed logs of Delara's falsified reports. Evidence, real evidence. Enough to recognize a pattern, but not enough yet to bring the weight of authority down. Not yet. I opened my laptop and drafted a formal contact request to the Office of the Child Advocate, outlining the broad strokes of community retaliation, coerced disciplinary structures, and escalating violence connected to a minor. The moment I clicked send, a thin thread of jurisdiction stretched outward, fragile, but real. But I wasn't done. Next came the State Attorney General's Community Conduct Division, the one responsible for nonprofit and HOA oversight. Their intake portal wasn't designed for emergencies, but the phrase violence connected to falsified community conduct logs triggered an automated referral tag. I submitted the initial packet without the attachments, just enough to pin a case number to the situation. The strategy wasn't to overwhelm them with data. The strategy was to make it impossible for them not to look deeper. I leaned back, letting the glow of the screen settle. Outside authority doesn't move fast unless the risk is undeniable. But violence inside a courthouse, retaliation against a minor, patterned misconduct from a governing body, those were triggers. The kind investigators don't ignore. My phone buzzed. A reply from the Office of the Child Advocate faster than expected. We received your request. Due to the nature of the report, we'd like to schedule an urgent preliminary review. Are you available tomorrow? Tomorrow. That was the first sign the system was waking up. I typed back yes before I even realized my fingers were moving. A few minutes later, another ping. This one from a colleague and evaluator whose expertise with youth aggression often put him in courtrooms similar to the one where Myra was attacked. He must have heard about the incident. The message was a single line: "If you need an affidavit on risk indicators, I'm available." I stared at the screen, feeling the shift. This wasn't support from friends, it was professional reinforcement. The kind of reinforcement Delara couldn't intimidate or silence. People in my line of work don't offer affidavits lightly. They do it when they know the evidence justifies intervention. I drafted the formal request, including the behavioral trends I'd logged. Not speculation, not accusations. Patterns, documented escalation. When I finished, I checked on Morel again. She was still asleep, her breathing finally calm. She looked younger like this, almost like the weight of the last year had loosened just enough for rest to find her. But the bandage on her arm white against her skin kept the reality grounded. She had been hurt. She had bled. And the people responsible believed they could twist the truth, shift the blame, rewrite the story before the ink had dried. Not anymore. I returned to the office and began assembling the packet the state would eventually request: annotated logs, behavioral summaries, timestamps, metadata inconsistencies, not as a father seeking vengeance. As a professional documenting institutional failure. Halfway through organizing the files, my computer made a sharp notification chime. An unfamiliar email address had reached out someone from the Community Oversight Review Unit, a division that almost never contacts individuals directly. The subject line read, "Regarding Merrow Glen HOA Conduct Inquiry." They weren't officially investigating yet, but they were looking. The beginning of scrutiny is always quiet. A question here. A file review there. Then suddenly the structure you thought was untouchable begins cracking under pressure. I saved the email and shut the laptop. I knew better than to celebrate early. Outside authority moves slowly, deliberately, but today's steps mattered. They moved this conflict out of neighborhood politics and into regulatory oversight. Delara's reach couldn't extend into those halls, not with falsified logs and a violent incident tied directly to her negligence. When I turned off the office light, the house felt different. Still quiet, but no longer suspended. More like the moment before tectonic plates shift, subtle, impossible to ignore. As I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the faint river breeze against the windows, I understood something clearly. Today was preparation. Tomorrow, the machinery would begin turning, and once the state started moving, the HOA's authority wouldn't just weaken. It would unravel. The next morning, the neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet, as if Merrow Glen itself was holding its breath. Clouds hung low, heavy enough to mute the sun, and the air carried that stillness before a storm, except the storm wasn't weather. It was everything I'd set in motion last night. Myra was awake when I stepped downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with her injured arm resting gently on a pillow. She tried to look composed, but exhaustion clung to her eyes, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep. I made breakfast she barely touched. She kept glancing toward the window, toward the street, as if expecting someone to appear, someone she no longer trusted. "I have a meeting today," I told her. "The Child Advocate's office. It'll help protect you." She nodded once, slow, like she wanted to believe the words, but her body hadn't caught up to hope yet. "You'll tell me how it goes?" Alvise. I left the house with my files organized into a single binder-structured, time-stamped, irrefutable. I knew better than to rely on emotional appeal. What mattered now was precision, truth without gaps, patterns without ambiguity, and above all, a narrative built from evidence, not accusation. The drive to the city center took half an hour. By the time I reached the office of the child advocate, my pulse had steadied into something controlled. The waiting room was plain, mismatched chairs, a map of state districts, posters about youth rights. It didn't need to impress anyone. It existed for function, not image, already the polar opposite of Merrow Glen's entire ethos. A woman named Arlette, sharp-eyed and efficient, met me in conference room B. She didn't soften her tone. She didn't offer small talk. She opened a notebook and said, "Start wherever the facts begin." So I did. I laid out the escalation sequence: bonfire night, retaliation, fines, the coercive behavioral review board, vandalism, and finally, the courthouse attack. I kept my voice even, professional. Her pen never stopped moving. When I reached the part about the falsified logs, her hand paused mid-sentence. "You're certain the reports weren't authored by a qualified evaluator?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "The language is fabricated. The metadata is inconsistent. The timestamps show pre-drafted entries." She wrote faster. "What's your professional background?" she asked. "Behavioral threat assessment, federal judiciary contract." Her eyebrows lifted for the first time. A tiny shift, but meaningful. "And you documented all of this yourself?" "Yes." When the meeting ended, she didn't dismiss me casually. She stood, shook my hand firmly, and said, "We're escalating this to the director. Expect contact soon." Outside the building, the sky had darkened deeper, clouds pressing lower, but I felt lighter. Not relieved, just sharper, focused. Outside authority had moved from curiosity to action, and once they started down that path, they rarely stepped back. Next was the State Attorney General's office, where I had a scheduled review for the HOA misconduct case number assigned overnight. The reviewer, a man named Travers, met me in a glass-walled room overlooking the city. His demeanor was different from Arlette's, more cautious, more political, but he listened. I presented the HOA bylaws, the overreach, the disciplinary structures imposed on minors, and the retaliatory escalation. He focused on the vandalism photo longer than expected. "This happened after your daughter testified?" he asked. "Yes, within hours." That establishes retaliatory motive. He made a note on his tablet, a real note, not the neutral ones bureaucrats used to stall. "And these logs," he continued, scrolling through the metadata printouts, "these are significant. If the president falsified compliance reports for a minor who later committed violence inside a courthouse, that's not an HOA matter. That's systemic negligence. He requested digital copies. I sent them before leaving the building." When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed again, 3 notifications this time. The first was from the child advocate's office. "We're initiating a preliminary safety audit for minors residing in Merrow Glen." The second was from Travers. "Forward additional correspondence between HOA members, especially anything involving the Behavioral Review Board." And the third was from an unknown number. "Please confirm availability for a multi-agency briefing next week." 3 messages, 3 agencies, 3 gears turning. The walk back to my car felt different from any step I'd taken in the last 2 months. Not victorious, just aligned. For the first time, the burden of proof wasn't mine alone. The system had accepted the weight. That was the shift I needed, the shift Delara never expected. When I reached home, the neighborhood looked the same. Perfect lawns, clean sidewalks, cars polished to reflect a world that wasn't real. But beneath all that polish, pressure had begun to build. Agencies were circling, inquiries were forming, files were being requested. And the kind of people who build empires out of bylaws and intimidation never survive real scrutiny. Inside, Myra was awake on the couch. She looked up as I entered. "How did it go?" she asked. "It started," I said. "Everything we needed to happen started." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. Then she nodded, small but sure. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off, not a storm yet, but close. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe without bracing, because preparation was over, and now came the shift where pressure turns into consequence. By the next morning, Subtle changes in Merrow Glen told me the machinery of oversight had started grinding beneath the surface. People walked their dogs faster. Conversations on porches cut short when I passed. Cars slowed near my driveway, not out of curiosity, but uncertainty like the neighborhood itself sensed the tremor just before a structure shifts. I spent most of the morning organizing the files the state agencies requested, refining annotations, tightening the sequence of events. Strategy mattered now, not anger, not emotion, structure. Because once authority enters a space built on illusion, the cracks spread quickly. Delara knew that too, which meant she'd start maneuvering. Right on cue, the HOA sent out a community-wide bulletin at 11:03 a.m. Merrow Glen Board Update. In light of recent misunderstandings, the board will undergo an informal conduct audit to reinforce community faith and transparency. Informal. Conduct. Misunderstandings. The language wasn't defensive, it was preemptive. She was trying to control the narrative before the state shaped one for her. But the timing was off. Too quick. Too polished. Too desperate. 30 minutes later, another alert appeared on my phone, not from the HOA, but from the Community Oversight Review Unit. Agents will be on site today for preliminary observation. Unannounced entry authorized per statute. Unannounced. Perfect. I glanced out the window, expecting nothing yet, but prepared for anything. Myrle sat on the couch with her arm propped up, watching an old show she wasn't really paying attention to. I didn't tell her about the auditors. No reason to give her one more thing to brace for. Just after noon, a white government sedan rolled slowly through the neighborhood. It stopped twice, once near the community pool, once near the playground. It wasn't obvious unless you knew what to look for, the kind of slow, systematic survey done by people trained to see the difference between aesthetic order and social tension. When it stopped a third time in front of the HOA office, I knew the real work was beginning. I walked down the street, not because I needed to interfere, but because I needed to witness. The HOA front lobby was glass-fronted and over-decorated with fake plants and framed community harmony posters. It looked sterile, controlled, manufactured. But inside, the illusion was finally cracking. Two state officials stood across from Delara, who maintained a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wore her power suit, the one she reserved for board meetings and photo ops, but power suits mean nothing when the questions come from people who don't answer to you. I stopped outside, a few feet from the glass, close enough to see but not enough to intrude. One official held a tablet. Another carried a clipboard. Delara gestured broadly, voice tight, posture too upright. The conversation wasn't going her way. Then I saw it, the shift in her shoulders, the tightening of her jaw, the widening of her eyes when the official tapped the tablet and rotated it toward her. Evidence review. Probably the logs. Probably the timestamps. Probably the proof she never thought anyone outside the HOA would scrutinize. She froze for a fraction of a second. A tell. The official spoke again, calm, measured, not aggressive. Höchstfaktuell. The kind of voice used when someone is being escorted from their imagined authority into real accountability. I wasn't close enough to hear words, but I didn't need to. Every investigator's body language tells a story. Today's story was simple. They weren't buying the script she'd rehearsed. Behind her, Thorne appeared in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, a knot of relief, fear, and inevitability. He didn't step forward. He didn't run. He watched, silently, as the structure he'd upheld for years tilted under pressure. When Delara saw him, she stiffened. She snapped something in his direction. He didn't reply. The investigator turned toward him, gestured him forward, and for a brief second, Thorne's eyes flicked to me through the glass. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But he stepped forward, voluntarily. That was the moment everything changed. You can drag a system toward collapse in 100 ways, but nothing fractures an abusive hierarchy faster than its own loyal member choosing truth over protection. The door opened. A few HOA members walked in, confused, whispering among themselves. They weren't hostile. They weren't defensive. They were scared not of me, but of finally seeing what their obedience had built. Inside the lobby, the officials continued their questions. Documents were requested, passwords, access logs, public meeting notes. Authority shifted from the HOA board to the state, without a single raised voice. I stepped back from the window. The next phase had begun, slowly, quietly, inevitably, not with confrontation, not with shouting, but with the steady, methodical unraveling of a structure that had relied for too long on no one looking closely. Today, they looked. The entire neighborhood was buzzing by late afternoon, subdued, hushed, fractured, but undeniably buzzing. Word had spread faster than any official notice. The state was inside the HOA office, and something serious was happening. People didn't gather openly. Marrow Glen residents were too conditioned for that, but clusters of whispered conversations formed along sidewalks, behind hedges, at mailbox stations. You could feel it in the air, a tremor running through a community built on curated stillness. That evening, the HOA called an emergency public meeting at the community clubhouse. The announcement email, sent barely an hour before the gathering, framed it as an effort to ensure transparency and stabilize community morale. But the phrasing was panicked, stripped of its usual polished veneer. Delara wasn't leading from confidence anymore. She was scrambling. I arrived 15 minutes early. Myrle stayed home with a neighbor she trusted, one of the few who hadn't turned away when things escalated. I didn't want her anywhere near this. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about the system that had failed her. The clubhouse hall was already half full. Rows of chairs faced the front podium, beneath banners that read community harmony and shared responsibility. They looked cheap now, empty, ill-suited for what was coming. People avoided my eyes at first, but that didn't matter. I wasn't here for validation. I took a seat near the aisle, close enough to see everything. Delara walked in flanked by two board members, her expression stiff, her steps precise. But the confidence she once carried like a weapon wasn't there. The state officials who had questioned her earlier were now stationed quietly along the back wall, clipboards in hand, unobtrusive but unmistakable. She cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she began. Her voice wavered only slightly, but enough for those paying attention. "Recent events have caused unnecessary panic in our community, and I'd like to address the misunderstandings directly." A ripple moved through the room, not anger, not support, just tension. People wanted answers. They wanted reassurance. They wanted anything that would anchor their sense of safety. She continued, "The incident at the courthouse yesterday was deeply unfortunate, and as a mother, a door at the back opened. Heads turned. Thorne stepped inside. He walked with uneasy purpose, the kind of walk a person uses when they've decided to stop hiding but haven't yet learned how to stand fully in the open. He didn't go to the board's table. He didn't take a seat. He walked to the state officials. A murmur rolled through the audience. Delara's face drained of color, then flushed with sudden heat. "Thorne," she snapped, her voice tight against the microphone, "please join us up front." He didn't even look at her. One of the officials whispered something to him, then gestured toward the audience. Thorne hesitated, then stepped forward, moving toward the podium. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. He reached the microphone and stared out at the room, people he'd worked with, lived beside, enforced rules for, people who trusted the system that now stood exposed. "I need to say something," he began. His voice cracked, not with fear, but with the strain of truth pushing through months of suppression. "I've been part of the compliance office for 4 years. I've issued notices, logged concerns, followed directives. But not all of those directives were honest. Not all of them were legal." A wave of whispers surged, sharper now, urgent. Delara stepped forward, hand raised. "This is not appropriate," the lead state investigator interrupted her with a calm, authoritative gesture. "He may continue." Something broke in her posture, then a sharp, involuntary tension, the kind that comes when control slips beyond retrieval. Thorne swallowed hard. "I saw reports. I logged concerns. Parents came to me with real fears about the safety of their kids, and I tried to do my job, but some of those reports never made it to the board. Some were deleted, others rewritten. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to challenge it. But I can tell you this: what happened in that courtroom wasn't a surprise." Gasps. A few people stood. One woman pressed a hand to her chest. Delara lunged toward the podium. "You're lying," she hissed, forgetting the microphone was live. "No," he said, voice steadying. "I'm finally telling the truth." He turned to the officials. "You have everything you need from me." One nodded, noting something on the clipboard. I watched the room shift as if the air itself leaned away from the board. Residents looked at one another, faces tightening with betrayal, realization, anger. They weren't confused anymore. They weren't controlled by polished emails or manipulated narratives. They were seeing the structure clearly for the first time. Delara tried to regain the room. "These are private matters," she insisted. "Procedural misunderstandings. This is a smear campaign." The investigator stepped forward. "That will be enough," he said, quiet but final. He addressed the crowd. "We have identified multiple violations of statutory governance protocols within Merrill Glen's HOA. Effective immediately, the board is placed under provisional suspension pending full review." The room erupted, voices rising, chairs scraping. A sudden release of energy contained far too long. Delara's expression shifted to shock, then denial, then a rage she couldn't disguise. It didn't matter anymore. Authority had shifted, and everyone knew it. The meeting dissolved into noise, shouts, disbelief, the rustle of people standing at once, but I stayed seated for a long moment, letting the weight of what just happened settle. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something deeper, quieter, the unmistakable hum of a structure collapsing under its own corruption, and for the first time since Mirel was hurt, I felt the current shift in our direction. When I finally stood, the investigators were already escorting Delara toward the back door of the clubhouse. Her face was twisted in outraged denial, clinging to her like armor that no longer fit. Thorne watched her go, shoulders slumped, but there was something resilient in his expression. Not pride, not victory, just the unburdening of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. People moved around us in disoriented clusters, some whispering, others lingering in stunned silence. A few residents looked at me with something close to apology, others with relief. The social dynamic of Merrill Glen had cracked wide open. No curated bulletin from the board could patch this. I stepped outside into the cool air. The sky had deepened into night, heavy clouds settling low over the rooftops. Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting soft halos over the now quiet streets. The neighborhood felt different, unmasked, stripped of its careful symmetry. You can't maintain illusion after truth has been spoken into a room full of witnesses. As I reached my driveway, I saw a small silhouette sitting on the porch steps. Mirel. She must have been watching from the window. When she saw me, she stood slowly, her injured arm tucked close to her body. "You're home," she said softly. "I am." I walked toward her, and she stepped forward, gaze searching mine. She didn't need details. She could read everything from the stillness in my posture. Did something happen? "Yes," I said quietly. The board was suspended. The state took control. She exhaled shakily, part relief, part disbelief. "So, does that mean we're safe now?" "We're safer than we were this morning," I said, "and tomorrow we'll be safer still." We sat together on the porch, and for a moment, everything else faded: the fight, the fear, the relentless sequence of attacks. Just her next to me, leaning gently against my shoulder, as though allowing herself to rest without flinching. I looked at the engraved river stone she kept by the porch railing, the one she'd etched during recovery therapy before all this started. A swirling pattern of lines, imperfect but intentional, representing resilience and flow. She'd chosen it because she wanted to remember that healing wasn't linear. Tonight, it meant something more. That even when violence breaks a community's surface, truth runs deeper. She spoke again, her voice small but steady. "What happens to Brannick now?" "The court will handle it," I said. "The real court, not the version Delara tried to invent, and the investigators will make sure every decision is based on fact, not manipulation." She nodded slowly. The night breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. "We didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "No," I said. "We didn't. And now the people who needed to see that finally do." We stayed like that until the neighborhood calmed entirely, until porch lights dimmed and the subtle rhythm of normal life began creeping back into the edges of the dark. Inside, after she went to bed, I reviewed the official notifications that had landed in my inbox. The Child Advocate's Office had opened a protective oversight case. The Attorney General's Division had escalated the HOA review from preliminary to active investigation. The Community Oversight Review Unit had requested a complete transfer of disciplinary authority from the board to the state. 3 agencies, 3 pathways converging. Delara's empire was done. But victory, real victory, wasn't about her downfall. It was about the space being cleared for my daughter to breathe again, without being labeled, threatened, or manipulated by people who hid behind the guise of community order. I stood at the window overlooking the courtyard where the inkstone mosaic lay. Even in the dark, I could see the faint shimmer of broken tiles where her peace once rested. Soon, I thought. Soon it will be restored properly, this time, under hands that honor what it means. This wasn't just the end of a conflict. It was the start of rebuilding our safety, our trust, our place in a neighborhood that had forgotten how to protect its own. Before turning off the light, I recorded a message for anyone who's ever dealt with abusive HOA power. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you think.